You're listening to the Music Book Podcast with your host, Marc Masters.
Hey, thanks for checking out the Music Book Podcast. I'm Marc Masters. I've written 2 books about music, No Wave, published in 2008, and High Bias, The Distorted History of the Cassette Tape, published in 2023. In this podcast, I talk to music book authors about how they get from their first idea to a finished book, and all the decisions they make along the way. So, this time around, I got to talk to Al Shipley. He's the author of Tough Breaks, The Story of Baltimore Club Music, published in August of 2025 by Repeater Books. It's a thoughtful, detailed, revealing look into a music movement that grew organically in Baltimore clubs, radio stations, record stores, and more, with beats and other musical ideas passed around quickly so that the styles and sounds morphed constantly. Figures such as Scotty B, Frank Ski, Miss Tony, Rod Lee, and Kay Swift all spurred on a scene that was remarkably open to all types of people, and though it may not have gotten a lot of play outside the city, it was as innovative and important as any club music scene in America. Shipley wrote about this music as it happened for the Baltimore City paper and on his own blog, Government Names. He draws on this experience as well as a wealth of interviews with musicians, producers, DJs, club owners, and more, digging deep into why Baltimore club music was such a vital and proudly local phenomenon. As he writes, local is sometimes seen as a shameful or insulting word in music media, but treating the music that's made in your neck of the woods with curiosity and respect is incredibly rewarding, and too many music writers have never even tried it. Fun music and dance music deserve thoughtful journalism and critical analysis as much as more conventionally serious art. As always, if you have any questions, comments, anything you want to tell me about this podcast, email me at musicbookpodcast@gmail.com. And you can always follow us at Instagram. Our handle there is @themusicbookpodcast. So here's my conversation with Al Shipley. Hope you dig it. So you lay out pretty specifically at the beginning of the book in the introduction how the book came to be. It was, you were doing a blog about Baltimore music, and then you started writing for the Baltimore City paper with Brett McCabe, who I wrote for him there too. He's a great guy. And he had the idea of maybe an oral history of Baltimore club music, but it never really quite materialized for the paper, and so you kind of took it over as an idea for a book. Is that a decent summation of how the whole thing got
Yeah,
together?
pretty much. Because you know how it is, like with weekly paper, it's like we're always, doing these specific stories, and we're like, okay, one of
Uh-huh.
these days we'll do something really larger scope for this.
Mm-hmm.
Because we did things like big music issue and year-end issues and stuff. So there were opportunities where we might have been able to do it. But yeah, because he moved from like music editor to arts editor, and then eventually left the paper, so it was just like, it never got done with him. And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, well, I want to do this as a book, and I got his blessing for it. So.
Uh-huh. That's cool. And so at that point that you decided it could be a book, how much had you done? Had you interviewed quite a few people already at that point?
Yeah,
Or?
because at that point, like when I decided to do the book, and this was, many years ago,
Mm-hmm.
this was like 2010 when I decided to do the book. But at
Mm-hmm.
that point, I'd basically, I'd started it. I did a bunch of interviews for a particular piece in 2006 where I talked to like DJ Boonman and a few other people who have been so helpful with the book through every stage of it.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, and then when the Baltimore State paper asked me to do kind of help with the music blog thing, when the like at the beginning of when print publications were like, okay, we need some internet only content. And so I was
Right.
like, one of the things I want to do is, as we're building up a body of knowledge for this club music oral history thing, I'll just do a weekly column. Like I had a friend, there was a free paper called Music Monthly, and my friend Kelly Connolly had a thing that was like the street beat. So I was like, I'll do one that's the club beat, and I'm just going to
Oh,
talk to
cool.
the Baltimore club producers and DJs. So I did dozens, I think, of those club beat
Mm-hmm.
columns from like probably 2007 to 2011, maybe.
Cool.
So that ended up being kind of a nice foundation. And then I kind of went from there of just kind of saying, okay, what are the holes in the story I need to fill in, and finding who I need to talk to again or who else I
Mm-hmm.
needed to talk to. Because I did interviews all the way up until last year. Like I was
Oh, wow.
still kind of like turning over rocks and talking to people I
Mm-hmm.
hadn't talked to yet, or talking to people I again just to like get extra information.
That's cool. And was there a point along the way where you decided, I'm not going to make this like a straight up oral history? I mean, you've got a lot of quotes, a lot of you get a lot of voices in there, but it's a narrative book. And was there like a light bulb go off at some point that you're like, wow, this is the way I need to do it, or how did that evolve?
Yeah. I think once it went from being an article to a book, it was like, yeah, it needs to
Hmm.
be. Because I mean, like, it's amazing to me, like there are things like "Please Kill Me" where it's like it's all quotes, it's all
Huh.
interviews. You don't even get the interviewer; you just get what was
Right.
being said by the musicians who were there, which is
Hmm.
really cool. But it also helps that those stories are a little more famous, so it's kind of like you don't need someone breaking in and giving you context. You can just get the
Right.
story from the band
Hmm.
members and whatnot. Where with this, I was like, yeah, I need to have the connective tissue. I need to get in there and explain a little more, which is nice. Because for me, it's like the top priority was getting the story and the words of the people who were there. But
Hmm.
contextualizing it is also a lot of fun because you end up having to like go into all these other musical histories. You go into like the James Brown breakbeat, and you get the Sing Sing and disco, and so you kind of get all
Hmm.
this other musical history in there in addition to just what happened in Baltimore.
Yeah, yeah, totally. It's a really rich book that way. There's so many different kind of strands that you can go into without having to like write a whole book about that strand or whatever. And
Hmm.
did you consider any kind of different structures or approaches in terms of like what you basically have is a lot of relatively short chapters. They're kind of thematic, although the book does have a chronological through line to it, but a lot of times it'll be like you're talking about one artist a little bit, but you're mixing another artist. Sometimes it'll be you're talking about a specific song or a specific beat that, was coursing through the scene. Did you ever think to, have any other ideas? Like maybe I'm going to do each chapter on an artist, a specific producer or artist, or did it always kind of flow like this when you started putting it together?
I mean, there were a couple of outlines where it did break down a little more thematically, and I remember at one
Hmm.
point, an editor I worked with on the book was like, you already gave this chapter outline to the publisher. So you shouldn't change it. I'm like, I'm going to give them another outline at the first opportunity, just because I was like, it's like it was like you know how it is. You start writing
Hmm.
something, and an outline's great, but once you get
Hmm.
in there, you make these other connections, and you
Hmm.
find the flow. And for this, I think even when it was a little more thematically split up, it was still chronologic to an extent because you kind of have to, and it became more chronological, but it's also like because certain strands did kind of lump together, and sometimes you wouldn't even know what year something happened, so I would just kind of have to
Right.
go with my gut of vaguely when it was.
Sure.
So if I was going to do this month by month, year by year, it'd be very difficult if I was really going to make a timeline. But making it roughly chronological really helped. And like I noticed, there have been a couple times when I've read from the book, and what I ended up doing was like I'd kind of read like a chapter here, and then I jumped to the chapter that continued that particular person's
Right.
narrative, like I kind of did
Hmm.
because there were a couple different separate Miss Tony chapters, and I kind of read those together at a reading recently at the Baltimore Book Festival. Because yeah, I mean there are all these interesting things that and it wouldn't make sense, like you couldn't do a Our Band Could Be Your Life type book where it's like each chapter is a whole different artist's career. I mean, that book it overlapped a little bit, but here it's completely
Hmm.
like almost everybody in this book knew each other or knows each
Right.
other. Obviously there's some people in the younger generation that don't know the people that passed, but otherwise it's like everybody played each other's music. Who was a
Hmm.
DJ? The producers sent their music to all the other guys. There were occasional rifts in the scene or competition, but it was very much this super collaborative thing where people were remixing each other's stuff, sampling each other's stuff. If someone had a hot new sound, it would kind of influence what everyone else was doing. So yeah, it wouldn't make sense to do capsule biographies of individual people because
Sure.
everybody was involved in everyone else's story.
Yeah. Did you find yourself having, I mean, you're so intimately familiar with all this music. You have been writing about it, on a very regular basis, and you went to the clubs and you listened to the radio. But did you find yourself still having to kind of be like, maybe make a sort of like family tree or something to map out all these different connections or did
Yeah,
those
I
kind of
mean,
flow for you?
I wouldn't really diagram or anything like
Hmm.
that. I mean, it'd be fun to. There was things like I might try to do like a map of the city at some point because in my head now it's like I really can kind of tell you. It's like like where this club was, where this club was, where this record store
Uh,
was, even like where
mhm.
particular people recorded. Like, because people would like kind of tell me like, like, oh, I was living on this street at the time. So I kind of know what neighborhood people were living on because
Uh-huh.
most of the stuff was recorded in home studios. So yeah, I never got to the point of a family tree, but it's like, again, it's like, if you picked any two names out of this book, I could probably tell you what they've done together or what connection they had,
Right.
even if they're never mentioned in the same sentence in the book.
Uh-huh. Totally. One of the things I thought was interesting about the way you wrote the book, and I thought worked really well, was that you sort of define Baltimore club music, but you don't restrict it. I mean, it's definitely a scene, a genre, and it's even a musical style, kind of. But it evolved a lot. Things were changing about it. But you also didn't want to be like, well, this is just an amorphous thing that anybody could. You kind of had to have certain elements. Was that something you were kind of thinking about as you wrote the book?
I mean, the interesting thing is that it seemed to really just happen without
Mm-hmm.
anyone thinking about it as a genre or particular style for a long time. It was just people making house records. And then it just turned into Baltimore had a house music style that was different than other cities. And it's like it's one of those things where it's like even the breakbeats that they used, Sing Sing and Think are both kind of staples of, like Think was used in the Rob Bass and DJ Easy Rock record before it was really used in Baltimore club stuff. So it's kind of
Right.
like these sounds were all in the bloodstream of hip hop, of dance music, and it just
Mm-hmm.
turned into it did get narrow in a very interesting way where it was like, the BPM is diversified a little bit, but for a long time, like almost everything was around that 130 BPM.
Right.
And like earlier it was maybe a little slower, and more recently, when it's kind of crossed over with things like New Jersey Club, it's gotten a little faster. But I mean, it's like it's been in a certain tempo. Guys like DJ Boomman and KW Griff told me about how like they tried to do more records without the sing sing break and people wouldn't like it as much. So they'd try another version of the song with the sing sing break
Yeah.
and they put it back in and people would like it more. So it was one of those things where it was like the producers, these guys are all pretty creative and they do hip hop, they do things in different tempos. They can do different things, but they figured out this formula that just worked in the Baltimore Club. So it was kind of like
Mm-hmm.
there was a conversation I think between the producers and the audience that made it really specific.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something where someone kind of came down and said, okay, it's all going to sound like this. And it doesn't all sound like it. There are actually a lot of records that don't have either of those breaks, especially in the 2000s, that we got a little more stuff that didn't have any break beats at all. But for a long time, Baltimore was breakbeat house. That's how it was distinguished from a lot of the other house music in the 90s, where you got more of the four on the floor drum machine kind of thing.
Oh, that's interesting, and I really find it fascinating too. And this is partially just my unfamiliarity with this kind of strain of music. Is that they're recording music and they're performing the recording of the music, not actually performing it like a band would perform, but they're playing it out and getting feedback, like you said, from crowds and how they react to things, and that's influencing making a new version, mixing it some. Also very influential is the clubs themselves, like how big they are, what kind of sound systems you use, which I thought was great that you got into the very specifics about these different people who were running the clubs and the way they built their sound systems and things like that. But I just found that a really interesting concept that these are people reacting to the playing of their music, like the playing of the recorded music is a live thing more so than in a lot of other scenes, I would think.
Yeah, and it's a definitely it's a special aspect of the scene because it's like a lot of times, obviously there's dance music, there's regional dance music scenes all over the world, but
Hmm.
they had this great, very, very small scene where yeah, they could just take a new song to their favorite club, hear it that night,
Hmm.
see how people reacted to it. They can keep toying with it before they put it on vinyl. And yeah, it's just it was really cool because it's like a lot of times, especially because it is kind of DIY and underground, and a lot of people who are only well known in their hometown won't get played on the local radio station. Like it's a hard thing sometimes for the most popular people in a city to get played on the
Right.
radio. So these people actually had weekly and nightly radio shows where they could hear their music. Like KW Griff for
Mhm.
20 years was on the local stations, especially 92Q. And basically, and one of
Mhm.
my favorite things the book is talking about how like people just email him tracks and he put them on the radio that night. I met
Yeah.
guys who were like 14 when they started getting songs on the radio.
Mhm.
Like there was just this great amount of opportunity for people to get involved, and because it is this kind of simple blueprint. I think of it more as like a punk rock band where it's like, it's like you learn these chords, you get going, you go, you get this break beat,
Mhm.
you find a sample you like, you get it in the tempo, and you're off to the races. And these guys can make a couple tracks, and if people like them, they have a little career going. So it
Mhm.
was really cool that it's like there aren't a lot of places where someone who's not known outside their city can actually go around their city and see people dancing to their music. And I mean, there would be some performance-based stuff where people would like Diamond K would get the people that he produced, like Big Rhea, who
Hmm.
has the song "Hey You Knuckleheads," and he would go and take her to different clubs in and out of Baltimore and perform the song. But a lot of the times, even the DJs that did the vocals on the tracks, like Rod Lee, is kind of the most successful Baltimore Club producer in terms of doing vocals on most of his hits. But when you see him
Hmm.
DJ, he's just spinning the records. It'll be his voice, but he's not
Hmm.
really getting on the mic and singing the songs like he does in the studio version. He just plays the record. So some
Uh-huh.
people are really DJs, and some people the performing is kind of secondary.
Yeah, totally. That's interesting bringing him up. He's a pretty big figure in the book. There's, you deal with a lot of different people and a lot of different artists, but there are a few that like him, Scotty B, Miss Tony, K Swift, Frank Ski, that recur because they were such big figures. Did that sort of come naturally just out of talking about the progression of the scene, or did you find yourself sometimes saying, I got to get Scotty B back in here because he was big in this too, and that kind of thing?
Yeah, yeah. Like I would talk to Scotty and Boo Man and some of these guys repeatedly to fill in blanks. But yeah, I mean, there was always kind of like by the time I really, because I'd hear the music a little in the 90s, but it wasn't until the 2000s I was like, oh, this is actually like this stuff is made here, and really understood what was going on. Because that's the thing is for a long time there was just not media coverage. That was one of the reasons why when I got to the Baltimore City paper, by that point Baltimore Club was starting to get national and international media coverage. It was kind of like, even the local media didn't really know too much about it because,
Right.
again, this is like, dance music can be kind of faceless. Most of these people didn't even have their pictures on their record sleeves, and the stuff was sold at very specific stores, and it was almost always singles and EPs, not albums. So it was so far outside, A, the kind of music media purview of coverage, but even like the dance music media was not covering it because it was a totally different thing. It was this
Mhm.
black city doing hip hop derived dance music. At a time when you think about the 90s and what was getting coverage, it was like drum and bass and all these international styles, European styles. So it's like it was kind of in this sweet spot where it was invisible for a long time. It was able to uh, develop independently and have its identity fully formed by the time people paid attention to it. And by that point, there was things like Bloghouse, there was things like Hollertronics.
Mhm.
There were all these scenes in other cities and even other countries that suddenly were like, oh, this stuff is really interesting. This is its own identity. And so you would get this stuff influencing dance music and hip hop all over the place. So it's like you
Mhm.
kind of go from it being, this very kind of closed off thing, not by design, because, a lot of times there are a couple of stories in here where, the Unruly Records guys would go to New York. They would try to get a record on the radio. They would try to get it to a big dance DJ or big hip hop DJ or like Fat Beats, the big hip hop store in New York, and just they were getting paid no mind. They could sell some records in Philly, but in the real taste-making places like New York, they were just getting ignored for years, and not for lack of trying. So it was one of these
Yeah.
things where it was like, once it finally happened, it didn't really happen in a way they predicted or controlled, but it eventually happened. But a lot of it was again, it was like there was just a lack of understanding of it. It took years for the people to agree what it was called. They might call it doo-doo
Right.
music, Baltimore breaks, all these other things.
Hmm.
So it kind of took a while just for people to know what to call it. And I talked to and Scott Seward, right?
Yes. Hmm.
And yeah, he's in the book a little bit because he was one of the first people
Hmm.
outside of Baltimore to write about it, and he made it sound really
Uh-huh.
exciting to other people. And he wrote
Hmm.
about it in the Village Voice and some other places. So it was like, there was
Hmm.
this gradual thing, but it took time, and it was kind of like now I can go in and kind of clean up the narrative, but it was a very, kind of
Hmm.
accidental evolution.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. It's kind of a genre that like, or a scene or whatever that kind of knew it was a scene, but also wasn't like no one was making the rules, no one was the kingmaker per se or anything like that. And I also thought it was really interesting how it seemed, and maybe you can tell me how much this is a accurate impression. It seemed a quite open scene in terms of number one, there seemed to be some competition, but not a lot of there weren't big rivalries. Everybody seemed to be open to collaborating and using each other's beats and stuff. And then also, like, there were prominent women in the scene, there was prominent trans people in the scene. It seemed pretty, especially for the time period, to be pretty. open. Is that the sense that you've gotten from being involved in it?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I tried to talk about when I talked to Wayne Davis, who was one of the first DJs like working in Baltimore in the 70s,
Uh-huh.
and he kind of curated the music at Odell's, which was one of the very early clubs in the 70s and
Mhm.
80s, and then he owned the Paradox. So he was a major
Mhm.
figure, and I talked to him about how, like, like what was, I try to get, what was the mix of people, and these clubs would have nights for college students, but there would also be a gay night. There would be a night that
Right.
was the kind of cultivated a queer crowd, and
Hmm.
there would be probably a little more mixing of the straight crowds and the gay crowds in these clubs than there might be in another city where there's a hip hop club or something, or a dance club where it's like, if you're playing, more mainstream house music, it might be a totally different mix. Where here it's like you kind of get this more aggressive style of house music that has a hip hop
Hmm.
crossover fan base. So I
Hmm.
think there was this again this kind of accidental evolution where it was like you get all these different people in the city enjoying it. So yeah, you get a little more openness where you kind of get characters
Hmm.
like Miss Tony, who was a crossdresser. You get K
Hmm.
Swift being the biggest DJ in the city for a few years and a woman. And I mean, I've
Hmm.
talked to other female DJs who, I think they still do have trouble getting the recognition in the scene, and it's almost like they're afraid that the K Swift thing could happen again, where it's like, oh, suddenly we're going to take the backseat to someone else. So
Oh,
it's a,
right.
so it's
Hmm.
still there's it's hard to get a really equitable mix of people in the scene sometimes.
Hmm.
But again, there is this whole history, and there are all these different people involved in it. So yeah,
Hmm.
it was cool how that happened. And again, it's like I don't think it was by design, but when you got this, especially Odell's, where they would be playing new wave, they would be playing disco, they would be playing
Hmm.
house music, and then hip hop started to come in. So it's like you just got this very diverse mix of styles before people here even started making dance records. Like there was this
Hmm.
whole mix of music that was happening in Baltimore before there was a house record that was pressed and produced in Baltimore.
Hmm. Hmm. That's cool. That's awesome. Just kind of going on that theme of openness, did you find generally that people were pretty open about talking to you about all these things? And did you feel like some of them you had to build a little trust first, or maybe they just kind of knew you from your blogging and your writing that were able to use that to connect with them?
Yeah, I mean, I was fortunate in that I kind of was doing this for a while, so a lot of
Hmm.
times by the time I talked to someone, they kind of knew who I was.
Hmm.
And I do still feel like an outsider where I'm like, I'm younger than a lot of these guys. I don't spend a
Hmm.
lot of time in the club. I
Hmm.
know a lot of music from when it was on the radio a lot and from
Hmm.
kind of collecting a lot of the mix CDs and stuff. But and sometimes I'm happy to kind of ask a dumb question to get the answer I'm looking for. Like I'll plead my ignorance sometimes with these guys, and because they're good guys and they're helpful, they'll set me straight
Hmm.
on stuff. But it's like how it is
Hmm.
sometimes when you're interviewing, you just have to admit your ignorance because the whole
Sure.
point is to get some information and pass on to the reader. You don't want to be
Right.
a know-it-all when you're interviewing
Hmm.
people who actually you want to know about. And sometimes I'd feel bad because I would kind of take longer to get around to talking to certain people, so I almost feel like I don't want to feel like I've neglected them by talking to
Sure.
them later in the process. Because
Hmm.
again, people have known I've worked on the book and the different columns about club music for a long time. But yeah, I mean, 99% of my interactions with people in the scene have been great because again, a lot of these guys are not natural born performers. There are a few
Hmm.
people who, really got into the spotlight and thrived in it. But a lot of these people are
Hmm.
just, DJs and producers. They like sitting in a room
Right.
working on a track for hours. They like sitting in the booth
Uh-huh.
and DJing the record. But it's like these are not people that I expected to be stars. So even when they became stars, I think it's sometimes they're a little unprepared for it. But
Sure.
it's great to talk to people who are not media
Uh-huh.
trained because in the music
Right.
media business, sometimes you're just talking to people who just give the same answer because they've been interviewed 100 times and
Uh-huh.
they have their whole routine down. So it's nice to talk to people who are sometimes I'm the first person who's ever interviewed them, or they only talk to an interviewer every few years. So it's nice to get more
Right.
unguarded, more real conversation.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And you also, for people who haven't read the book, even though it started as an oral history and you interviewed a lot of people, you have secondary sources too. You have a decent bit of quotes from magazines and or especially articles that were written in Baltimore, and then you've got the section on Scott's article, and you get into the Wire and stuff. And so I'm curious how your process was in terms of doing that kind of research. Did you set aside a time where like I'm just going to dig into everything I can find about club music that was published, or did you sometimes think, oh hey, I'm writing about Rod Lee right now. I wonder if he ever got interviewed by so and so, or I'm just curious how that process went.
A lot of it was just stuff I knew about already. Like there were articles I
Hmm.
had read when they were published, or I found them at some point years ago. So I had a lot of kind of links set aside. And then as the thing was coming together, I'd kind of figure out where I could put things in. Sometimes I'd find,
Hmm.
interesting things because, like, again, the music media wasn't covering this stuff as it was happening a lot. But then I'd like realize that there were whole things like with the Club Odells where sadly, like after the original owner died, it kind of passed
Hmm.
through different ownership, and there was basically like a drug kingpin running the place. So there were all these articles in the Baltimore Sun about the place getting shut down and reopened, and
Oh
and
yeah.
there was
Hmm.
a whole drama there, and it was almost kind of really tertiary to the music, but it was still just kind of part of the story. So it was
Hmm.
interesting to kind of go through all these old newspaper clippings and find that stuff. And also, again, like I was not the only person to write about this stuff, and so it was fun to put together a bibliography that kind of
Hmm.
and could draw on things that friends of mine wrote in the Baltimore Sun or
Hmm.
the Baltimore City Paper and other places because there was also a lot of some people got great quotes from people I talked to, and the quote they got was better than anything I got on a particular subject. So I would be like, oh, yeah,
Sure.
I'm going to use their thing
Uh-huh.
in the book and
Uh-huh.
give them the footnote.
Yeah, that makes sense. How much as a writer in general, and then maybe specifically to this book, do you ever kind of think to yourself consciously about the style you're writing in or the way you're approaching it in terms of, like what you're including and also how you're presenting it? I mean, what I liked a lot about your style in this is it's very information heavy. There's not a lot of paragraphs that are just like big philosophical. It's mostly, this happened, this happened. There's a very kind of real time feel to it, which I really liked. Is that are those kind of things you ever think about, like pull back and think about, or are you kind of like, you pretty confident in your style now, so you just write the way you write?
My approach has always been to, yeah, I mean, there's all this stuff you want to communicate first and
Hmm.
foremost, and sometimes there's a lot of very quote unquote voicey writing now where the style
Hmm.
can really get between the reader and the subject matter. And it's like if I'm really trying to get this story to people first and foremost, and to kind of
Hmm.
let the musicians tell the story as much as I can without getting in the way. I will. With this book, it was nice because it's like as a freelancer you will work on a piece for a week or a month, but it's like you get through it as well as you can and it's done. And you're
Hmm.
not necessarily sitting there and trying to phrase things as elegantly as possible. So it
Sure.
was nice to be able to, do draft after draft after draft of each chapter and kind of get a chance to say, okay, what's a better way of saying this? So for
Hmm.
me, the style was more deliberate than ever just because I got to, you know,
Oh yeah.
go over each bit of it so many
Hmm.
times, but still my style is and I think you're lying to yourself if you say your style is an absence of style. But if you're not trying to
Right.
joke around or impress someone with your vocabulary too much, it's like for me it's like there's just all this stuff I'm trying to get across. And one of my real guiding posts as a journalist or as a writer, it's just like the truth is interesting. If I'm interested in it,
Yeah.
I can't
Hmm.
foolproof make everybody find it as interesting as I do, but I
Hmm.
know that just me being interested in finding the things that are interesting in it is going to, lead the way. I don't have
Right.
to, bend the truth or
Hmm.
glamorize it or really put a ridiculous angle on it to make it entertaining. I know that,
Hmm.
people and music and all these things that have happened are intrinsically interesting to me. So it's going to be
Hmm.
intrinsically interesting to somebody, even if it's not
Sure.
everybody. So
Yeah.
for me, it's like just to be a nerd and to care about this stuff is the number one priority of like just
Hmm.
embracing the fact that this is this niche musical interest that is worthy of somebody's time, and if it's worthy of my time it might be worthy of yours.
Hmm.
So a lot of it is
Hmm.
just just caring about it is half the work.
Oh yeah, that totally makes sense. And along those same lines, because you were, this isn't something you're coming in from like not having lived there, and you were experiencing it and watching it and listening to it, you have a few moments here and there where you do say, "Oh, and I happened to go to the club once," or "Oh, I remember what happened when I found out that K Swift had passed away," and things like that. And I think those are really effective, but you use them relatively sparsely. You just sort of pick your moments when you think that's most appropriate. Was that something you thought about, like how much or how little I want to put my own experiences into the book?
Yeah, absolutely. Because again, it's like there was all this stuff that happened when I either before I was born or when I was too young to have any firsthand knowledge of it. And then in the second half of the book, it's kind of when I was involved in the scene and I knew the people and stuff. So yeah, the fact that I saw K Swift at Artscape the day before she died, and a lot of people did. That was like a huge moment for her, and she was about to like sign a new record deal and all these things. So for me, it was just always part of the thing. It was very dramatic to have seen her be really happy for her, and then that tragedy, and like Monday morning waking up to get texts, like
Yeah.
it's like it was a hell of a thing. And I sat down with about I think 8 or 9 people that she worked with for 10 years 2 weeks after she died. And just like it had to be the emotional climax of the book just because it was the
Right.
emotional climax of the entire scene. It was just the fact that, someone who really was the most famous person in the scene just died. I think she was about to turn 30 years old, died really young, completely unexpected. People still really are not sure what exactly happened, if she had a head injury in the pool or something. But it's one of these
Hmm.
things where it was a very traumatic moment for the scene, and so I was like, I had to kind of put myself into it because I was there, and also just again the emotion of like seeing her at Artscape, and then just the next day she's gone. It was insane.
Yeah, that's crazy. Yeah, and I also really liked thinking of her. I liked the way you at times would broaden out a little bit to other parts of the city and other things that were even related to club music, but still slightly different to give a sense of the whole city and what was happening then. I mean, and also to also like it helped draw me in a little bit because there were a few things I did find recognizable. Like I loved that you said when Jason Urich booked her at Floristry, which I had been to, and she walked in and she was like scared, which cracks me up because I remember the first time I went there, I was scared too. Like I remember looking that they had a stove there that was so encrusted with old food that but I also loved the place. And then also like the Scotty B selling all his records to True-Vine. I used to go to True-Vine a lot. And I thought it was cool that you added little textures here and there that give a bigger sense of the city itself. So it's not just this scene happening inside the clubs with the outside not mattering anything. That's the same with The Wire being playing a role in the whole story too.
Yeah, and I mean and there's the whole thing of Smaltimore where it's kind of like everybody knows, or there's connections
Uh-huh.
between people whether you expect it or not. Like I literally the bookstore Normal's Books and Records, I did a
Mm-hmm.
thing with them for Baltimore Book Fest. I remember when I brought in some copies for them that were signed by people who are in the book. One of them was Diamond K, and the guy working the counter at Normal's was like, "Oh yeah, Dwayne, I used to live in the same apartment building as him." It's just
Nice.
like it's constantly it's like that. Someone came up to us at the book festival who was like, my mother or my typing teacher was K Swift's mother. And it's like there's all these
Oh
things. It's
wow.
like people, everybody knows everybody. And again, it's like you
Uh-huh.
get things where it's like because again, The Wire was a big thing to happen in Baltimore at the same
Hmm.
time as club music, and so it was kind of inevitable that there would be a little bit of club
Hmm.
music in The Wire. So it was fun to
Hmm.
explain how that happened and which songs got in there and whatnot, and the fact that it's like it was a nice financial boon for these guys to get like $10,000 for a track that's in a HBO show.
Yeah.
Aside from people just caring about The Wire, it was just a nice moment. And the fact that like when people didn't know The Wire was going to be such a big deal, but HBO like actually had K Swift's promo team do the wraparound van with The Wire on it. So there'd be a Wire van that K Swift was driving around the city.
Uh-huh. That's cool.
And that wasn't because she was a club music celebrity. It was just because they were using the local radio station to promote the show because it was a Baltimore show. And things like Rod Lee's song "Dance My Pain Away," the indie rock band Wyoke, one of my favorite Baltimore bands, did this great cover of it.
Hmm.
So and Cisco, who's kind of the biggest pop star to come out of Baltimore in that era, people didn't even really realize. I didn't realize for a long time because there's the song that basically put out right before Thong Song, Got to Get It. There's an official Baltimore Club remix of it. I always thought it was just another like some club DJ did it, and then I
Uh,
realized, oh, it's actually on the 12 inch of the
uh-huh.
song right there with the Thong Song, and find out that DJ Class actually worked on that. They didn't even credit him on the record. So it's like, there's all these things that were, it's like
Uh-huh.
club music was in the bloodstream of all these other things that were happening in Baltimore. So yeah, you kind of get these little cameos where it's like DJ Class
Right.
did stuff for a John Waters movie, so everyone's John Waters
Right.
in there. I
Hmm.
think I didn't work any Barry Levinson reference into the book, but I did do a quote of Diner, I think, in the acknowledgement somewhere. So
Yeah. That's cool. That's cool. I think if I'm remembering it right from the intro, you came up with the book title pretty early on once you
hmm
decided it was going to be a book. What sort of inspired? I mean, I think it obviously breaks has the double meaning, but I'm curious, do you have a feeling of where that how you thought of that title?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just popped in my head one day. I was like, yeah, I'll
Hmm.
do something with that just because, again, the breakbeats being what distinguished it from a lot of the house music of the time. So I wanted to play that up, and the fact that Baltimore's considered a tough city. Baltimore Club
Hmm.
is considered kind of tougher and more inner city or whatever than a lot of other dance music. So it's just kind of using those mental ideas along with just the idea of playing up again. I'm a drummer, so my way into a lot of
Hmm.
the music is the fact that it's breakbeats, it's live drums.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
love programmed drums. I love playing with drum machines, but to me, a lot of the physicality of a lot of music comes from like listening to the drummer play and kind of knowing, it's like if you play drums, you kind of feel drums in your body. I think maybe different than other people do. You feel the bass drum in your
Yeah.
feet. You feel every other thing in your hands and your wrists. So for me, it's like that was a big way into. So I definitely want to, talk about the drums, talk about the break beats, also talk about
Hmm.
like J-Bo Starks, the James Brown drummer, who is, on almost
Right.
every Baltimore Club track.
Right. That's cool. In that previous answer, we were just talking about the Cisco and not him, the DJ not being credited on it. That's an interesting kind of theme that runs throughout the book is the whole concept of sort of the authorship and the credit and the idea. Everybody's using some of the same beats, and sometimes it's mutating in other things where the original person isn't really getting known about, nobody even really knows that they were at the start of it. But I get the sense that people weren't too worried about that overall. I mean, every once in a while I think somebody would be like, I invented that, you should be talking about me when you use it. But it didn't seem like as big a deal as it might in some scenes, that there was sort of this nebulous kind of version of authorship or ownership over certain sounds. Is that about right, you think? Or
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
Mhm.
there's so many things where again, one of the major records early on was I Got the Rhythm, and that was credited to DJ
Mhm.
Equalizer and Scotty B. And I'm still not entirely sure. I feel like they've both kind of debated who, was more involved in that record or whatnot, or if someone's name was just on it who didn't do a lot or whatever. And I got into a whole thing with Throw Your Guns Up, which was known as a Miss Tony record, but then Jimmy Jones said, "Oh, I kind of was doing that chant in clubs, and Miss Tony took it and put it on a record."
Mhm.
And then after both of them had passed away, someone was telling me that a third person was like, "Oh no, that was my thing," and then Miss Terry
Uh-huh.
took it. So it's like it's kind of one of these things. And that person had also passed away. So it was like there was a point, and I kind of this was one of the fourth wall moments where I kind of addressed the room. I'm like,
Mhm.
it's like there is a dispute of authorship about this one song involving three people who are no longer alive. So I have no idea what to tell you other than
Right.
that the definitive
Mhm.
version was recorded by Miss Tony. So it's like, and there are certain things like that, but again, it's like the whole genre is based on a lot of uncleared samples. So it's kind of like
Mhm.
there's this house of cards. You don't want to be filing lawsuits when
Right.
everybody is open to a lawsuit if that's where you
Right.
want to go with it. And so that was one of the
Mhm.
things I think that was tough when it's like when there was talk of major labels taking interest in this stuff. It's kind of like how do you do it? Suddenly you got to clear a million things if it ever got to that level. So it's interesting.
Yeah.
Hip hop was so mainstream so quickly that they kind of had
Mhm.
to reckon with this at a certain point, and there was a really
Right.
sad moment where it was like kind of people had to stop using as many samples as like Public Enemy used or something, and
Mhm.
that kind of cut the genre off in some ways creatively.
Mhm.
But Baltimore Club never got to that level, so they just kind of kept running wild with the samples.
Right.
And it helped with the creativity. I mean, there were people
Mhm.
like Rod Lee who would kind of make a show of, I'm going to make a hit record without a sample. I'm just going to use Well, I mean, and even then, Riley would still use the Lynn Collins and the Gaz samples. So he would still use samples, but he would still be like his hooks would be original.
Mhm.
So there were definitely things where it's like, yeah, there's this communal authorship. There's also like some people would make a track that was so popular that would just kind of become the foundation of a million other things. Like Debonair Samir, he did the Samir Horns record, and
Right.
then that became kind of the basis for a lot of Say What things, and a few other producers had big records because the horns kind of almost like the synth horns that Samir did were kind of like a new element, like the breakbeats, or it was just kind of part of the communal
Hmm.
creativity. And again, I'm sure he could have said, "Oh, this is mine, don't use it," but I don't think that was really the spirit of the scene. I think in maybe some specific instances, someone might say, "Hey, you're making too many tracks with my creative thing in it, cut it out."
Hmm.
But for the most part, yeah, I think the avenues were pretty open for people to kind of share. I get into how in the mix CD era, it got a little more proprietary, where it was because people were selling CDs
Right.
outside the DJ community. It'd be kind of a little more like, oh, I want this exclusively. I'm not going to give you this track. But for a long time, it was like it was not very closed off. People were sharing the music, they were sharing the ideas, they were sharing the sounds, they were playing each other's music, they were remixing each other's songs. So yeah, there was definitely like a more communal idea than what we're used to. It was almost, like that a folk music thing of just, like everyone kind of pushing these certain ideas forward bit by bit instead of someone, making 12 original songs and releasing an album.
Right, which is great. I love that about it because it seems like this probably couldn't have flourished the way it did and grown and had so much activity and so many people involved if a few of them had said, every time I hear you using that beat, I'm going to call the cops or whatever,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah.
So I guess what the final thing I'd be interested to hear, and I'm not sure if you even necessarily have an answer for this, but because you were so involved in writing about the music for so long, I'm sure you always have been a big fan and real appreciative. But going through this process of putting it all, so much of it into one particular piece as opposed to writing a blog entry or a quick interview or a review or whatever, did it give you some, did you find yourself finding a new level of appreciation for the scene or the music?
I mean, probably, but it's just it's a very, the appeal is very visceral. So for me it's like,
Hmm.
I gain new appreciation for certain records, and because again it's like I came in late in the where the narrative is, so it's kind of like I knew a lot of, the later records before I would learn kind of
Hmm.
the foundational stuff. So I would
Hmm.
kind of go back, and it's great because, it's like the first time I listened to some of these really early records, I kind of was like, oh, this is just, kind of so different. It's kind of like less high energy. And then I go back now, I'm like, oh, this is really cool for its time. Because, it's like 80s house, like Chicago house, it's
Hmm.
very lo-fi compared to what we think of as house music. And Baltimore kind of
Hmm.
continued that a little bit, but even more so, I think, because it's like, people were creating the genre from scratch with
Right.
the earliest drum machines and samplers they could get their hands on that were affordable. So, again, there's so much DIY spirit, and it's kind of like the further you dig into the stuff, the more you appreciate the creativity of it, even if it's
Hmm.
not really polished and easy listening sometimes. So
Sure.
yeah, I mean, I definitely I gained a new appreciation for certain stuff, but for me, it's also the nice thing about finishing the book was also there were a few years where I was not working hard on the book, and so every time I turn on the radio and I hear club music, I'd enjoy it, but I'd also get a little stressed out because I'm thinking of all the things I need to do for the
Right.
book. So
Right.
having
Uh-huh.
the book finished kind of lets me
Uh-huh.
regain a little joy from the music too.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Though I know that feeling when you're in the middle of a project, even shorter ones that you're kind of putting off, and then you hear something, you're like, oh, I got to get
Yeah,
back to that. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Well, I think you
yeah.
did a great job. I really enjoyed the book a lot, and I think it's a really important book to capture a scene that, like you said, didn't get a lot of media coverage, and I really appreciate you talking to me about it.
Thank you, man. Thank you for reading. I was really excited to get on here. Thank you.
The Music Book Podcast is produced, edited, and hosted by Marc Masters. Our theme music is by the great band Savak. Our logo was designed by Walter Carlton. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave a rating and a review wherever you hear it. And thanks so much for listening.